Welcome to the How to Succeed podcast, the show that helps you get to the top and stay there. This is How to Succeed with the ABCs of Diversity. My guest this week is Martine Kalaw. You can find her at martinekalaw.com. She made it easy for you. She is the author of the ABCs of Diversity and a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner. So we're going to explore that a little bit. This following podcast is copyrighted by Sandler Systems LLC and protected by U.S. copyright laws. Sandler is the worldwide leader in sales, management, and customer service training. You can subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening to it right now and find additional resources at Sandler.com. I'm your host, Mike Montague, Director of Community Engagement at Sandler, and this is How to Succeed with the ABCs of Diversity. Martine, welcome to the podcast. Tell me a little bit about the ABCs of diversity, because I've heard of other ones. I've heard of like DEI and LGBTQ plus. What are the ABCs of diversity?
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, thanks so much for having me. The full title of the book is The ABCs of Diversity, A Manager's Guide to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the New Workplace. So really, this is meant to be a primer to support managers and human resources that really do influence the makeup and the demographics of an organization. So when we think about diversity, well, I'll start with this. I wanted it to be the ABCs because one, it's provocative, two, because when we think about and we navigate the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have the tendency to really kind of approach it from an academic standpoint, because that's how diversity, equity, and inclusion was introduced to us through the media, using all this academic jargon. And so what it does is it makes people really nervous about saying the right thing or the wrong thing and keeps people from engaging in the conversation. We don't want to be shamed. We don't want to be blamed. We don't want to offend someone. Historically, when we said something and it wasn't politically correct, we got reprimanded. So we're scared of that. And we just want to say the right stuff. So we're so caught up in the language that we're really not actually engaging in the movement around diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is learning, listening, understanding, validating, and evolving. And we're all part of that process. So that is why I decided, hey, I want to create this conversation and present it in a primer-like fashion to remind managers particularly, that a lot of the tools that we need to navigate diversity, equity, and inclusion are the same tools that we need as managers, right? And when we think about why we're targeting managers and human resources in this conversation, is because they really do influence the makeup of the organization through hiring, promotion, right? Attrition, all of that is really a conversation between managers, hiring managers, and human resources professionals, right? Leadership is involved. They're involved in, securing the budgets. They're involved in leading the business, but they're really not involved in the intricacies and the day-to-days of people's evolution within an organization. So I thought, why not create this primer, equip managers and human resources with the language, invite them into the conversation. And in each chapter, it's really about how do you look at this, approach this from an introspective standpoint, really understand it for yourself. And then there's an application. So take it back to your team and apply it. So that's really the ABCs of diversity.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm excited to jump into it with you because there's so much to unpack there already. But I love that premise of the basics and getting a few things right. I think sometimes when we talk about this topic, we have a tendency to overcomplicate it and try to make everybody happy or make things that fit all situations so we don't have any mistakes or any complaints. And I feel like that's just really unrealistic. I think what you said, if you get down to the simplicity of it and a primer of, if we come at it with these right attitudes, behaviors, and set up some systems and techniques to have open conversations, it's a human issue, and human issues are going to be messy no matter what, right?
It's a reminder, right? I love that you said it's a human issue. I just wanted it really, I wanted to remind people and reassure people that a lot of the skills that you already have just as a human being
Mhm.
are the same skills, the same tactics you would use navigating a conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because I remember leading a workshop once on microaggressions, and I would have managers like, they were like, Martine, well, how do I know how to deal with this? If someone comes up to me and says they feel like they've been offended by something someone says, like, what do I do? I'm like, what else? What do you do when your direct report comes to you for any other problem?
Yeah,
Right?
there you go.
And you could see the light bulb, like, wait a minute, like, oh, yeah, duh, because we overthink it because of the way that DEI has been packaged in the last couple of years. And certainly there are conversations that are much more complex, but we have to start from like an equalizing standpoint, right? And this is like, find that common ground, which is, as managers, as people in an organization, we know how to interact with people. The management skills that most organizations offer to their managers, new managers, experienced managers, are the same skills: coaching, active listening, right? The skills we use in sales, all of those things are the same skills that we would use in engaging in conversations and initiatives around DEI. So if we can remind people of that, I think that there's less of this like anxiety of saying the right thing and the wrong thing. And then we can really start to make change, right? And I really, I wrote this in response to a number of things, but I remember working in one company where I was speaking to the head of the director of the tech team. Actually, it was the CTO. And I said, really want to get your input on, diversity. And he's like, well, I'm a white guy, so I don't think you're going to want I don't want to say the wrong thing. And I was like, this is a problem. This is the real problem, because if you feel like your voice isn't as valuable in this conversation, then we've got a problem, because all voices need to be heard in this conversation to really move the needle in the right direction. And so we don't want to exclude people. And that's the irony of what I've seen some of these diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts do, ending up, and it ends up excluding people. We want to invite everybody into the conversation. We're not going to always agree, but we can start to understand each other. And that's part of the progress that can be had.
Yeah, and I guess to wrap up this initial attitude portion here, is there any other common misconceptions or ideal attitudes of people that are getting it right? Because I feel like a lot of times it is misconceptions, almost like sales itself, I feel like is a really good stereotype, because it is genderless and it's a role, right? It doesn't have any ethnicity either. That in sales, we see salespeople as a stereotypical, like pushy business card slinging salesperson. And that's not what most salespeople are. But I think you can't really blame customers for thinking that that stereotype is true, because some people do live up to that, or what you see in movies and television
Right.
are that. And I think it's a really interesting kind of framework to talk about this, because
Yeah,
a lot of what we're already fighting in sales are the same conversations we would want to have. Do any of those jump out as common misconceptions or things that we should think about to get our head right to even approach this conversation?
Yeah, I love that you're bringing that up, Mike. Yeah, there are lots of misconceptions. When I work with organizations, I say, like, let's do away with the jargon, right? Like, that's already confusing enough. Like, people say, they use terminology that they hear, they don't really know what it means. So one of the first things I encourage organizations to do is, like, if you don't like the word privilege, come up with your own word, right? Like, you don't have to use that word. If it doesn't work for you, don't use it. Come up with what works, the language that works within the culture of your organization around DEI, right? If you don't even like the word diversity, equity, inclusion, well, call it something else. It doesn't matter. So that's part of it. I think the other is it feeling like, we saw in the last 2 years, there's an uptick in terms of like diversity, equity, inclusion being a priority in response to the social unrest, particularly fueled by the murder of George Floyd. But now, it's starting to kind of, taper off. And with some organizations, it seems like it's very performative, right? And so what we want to do is we want to keep that momentum and really help organizations understand that DEI is a business imperative. And so what I like to do is give organizations permission to say that it's not just the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do. And dollars can be tied to DEI. And historically, people feel like, generally speaking, that cheapens DEI, right? Like, oh no, you're talking about money. That's wrong. It's about humanity. Yes, it is, but it's also about the bottom line. And so we're able to tie KPIs, key performance indicators, to DEI. Well, then guess what? Everyone, that's a common language that a business will understand. And so I think that's a common misconception, that it doesn't tie back to the business. And if it does, and if we're talking about numbers, it's really just about, well, people stay with an organization. Well, it's beyond that. It goes directly, you can tie it directly to KPIs, particularly if you're in sales, right? So that's another misconception that I would say that I hear oftentimes.
I wanted to jump in on that one because I've seen research myself that even if you just look at people's LinkedIn networks, the people that have the most diverse LinkedIn networks get the most opportunities, make the most money, and make the most sales, because you're getting opportunities from areas and people and other cultures that you wouldn't get if you were just in the same groups or same industries and other things. So no matter what you want to put that label on, age, race, diversity, sex, any of those things, the more diverse it is, the more powerful your network is, because you're bringing opportunities to the table. So especially for sales, I think that is really interesting for what you're talking about here, and these things with the business ROI case. And I definitely, if I was doing it, I would lean into that it's like, sure, it's a good thing to do for humanity, but it's also a good thing to do for your business.
I absolutely like to start with that, particularly if the organization is for profit, they're, a business, B2C business. It's like, that's a quick win to start to identify where is their opportunity to increase market share. But I want to mention another misconception. I think people equate diversity, some people, and I love that people, when I work with organizations, individual staff members they feel comfortable enough. I've been told that I can be disarming to share this information with me. There's this misconception for some individuals that diversity means we're diluting the quality of candidates that are going to come in. That is not true, right? And that's because in some organizations, there are quotas, right? And, that's really up to an organization to really decide on whether they're going to, pursue quotas. My approach is not necessarily a quota driven. I think it's always good to have targets with any business, any department. You got to have targets and a baseline so we know what we're measuring against. But quotas can feel very punitive, and then it can set the wrong precedents, right? And so when we have targets and we widen our network, right? That's really what it is. It's not about, hey, we're only going to look at this group of individuals, or we're only going to target this individual. It means we're going to consider the fact that we have not widened our network. If we widen our pool of candidates, then the likelihood of bringing in more people that we wouldn't have brought in before increases, right? Because we widen the pool, candidates are still qualified. And that's really what effective diversity is, right? And, diversity, equity, and inclusion also means it's not just about representation, but it's that representation at different levels within the organization, right? If you have just a lot of representation at the entry level, well, and there isn't mobility, right, within the organization, well, then what's the likelihood, right, that you're going to see a whole lot of impact? Because the people at the top make the most decisions, influence the business. So we really want to look at representation at every level. That's what real effective diversity, equity, and inclusion can look like. I mean, there are a whole bunch of other ones I can go on.
Yeah, I want to ask you deeper about how we do that, because I think that particularly in sales, we see it's one of those industries that the other example is like in the NFL, coaches and ownership groups is not represented at the same level as the players, I think you inherently get that. And sales seems to be the same way at this moment in time, that the sales teams are becoming more diverse, but the sales leadership and business ownership not as much. Do you feel like that's naturally a bottom up thing, or are there certain behaviors and actions that we can take in order to fix this? Because I feel like getting that ball rolling is the hardest part.
Yeah, there's a process. There are many approaches, right? I mean, that's why there's usually, if we approach diversity from a program standpoint, we'll come up with a great program, a great initiative. Let's recruit and widen the pool. But if we don't have strategy, then, you can bring in diversity. And then if you don't have a way to establish equity and inclusion, people won't stay, or they're not going to be able to, meet the needs of the organization or the team. And so a lot of it, you've got to do a couple things at once, right? That's why we've got diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it's really about what inclusive practices are being established within teams. Do people feel invited? And perception is the key, right? I worked within an organization where, I kid you not, I was probably one of two Black people, right? And everybody was really nice to me, but I did not feel included. So if you asked them, did you create an inclusive environment? They would have said yes, right? Did I feel included? No, right? For a number of reasons. One, because I was one of two, right? Mm-hmm. There are a number of little nuances, things when there were examples of, I think I would go to these sales conferences, because I know we were talking about sales a little bit earlier. We would go to sales conferences, and the images and the examples that we were hearing about regarding, these case studies were always male, white male specific. These were subtle things that, to them, to the individuals, they didn't really think about it because, for them, it was just the norm. For me, it just made me feel less included, right? So these are the things that we can do as far as inclusion, right? Is to really consider what might be this person's perception, and there are different ways to gather that information, and how do we create more inclusion? And that also falls on the manager, right? Going back to my book, the ABCs, shameless plug, is, allowing the manager to exercise that part of their brain where they're thinking about, well, what can I do to make sure everyone feel included? What are the checks and balances that I can use to see if people are feeling included, right? And then equity piece. Equity, we think about just compensation, but it also is, what kind of training are we equipping people with, right? All of that is involved in making sure that when we bring in the right person, they're able to thrive within their position, right? And then the last, but equally as important piece is mitigating bias in the promotion process, right? That mobility piece, we know that everything falls, it's all at the hands of the manager to really influence your career trajectory. So if a manager, and his studies show that historically, women and people of color, like in performance reviews, are usually measured based on their personality, right? And white men are measured or rated based on their performance, right? And so these are things that, if we all have biases, we just do, just as human beings. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to see these things. We're not going to necessarily, call them out. Oh, here it goes, I'm being a little biased here. So there have to be checks and balances that are established within the organization to identify these things, not to reprimand the manager, but to equip them with ways to, move beyond those, mitigate those biases. So all of that sort of has to happen, all of, together for this, wonderful, recipe to work. So that's why I say, it really goes back to being a strategy. It's a business case, as to why DEI is important, and it should be treated like another business structure, just like sales, just like, tech, or any other piece of the business.
I think that recipe is a really good analogy, that there are a lot of moving parts and steps and ingredients you need into the mix here. I wanted to ask you one more follow-up as we go into the technique and really kind of dive into this, because I've struggled with this, and I feel like this is me as a marketer and somebody that has an audience on a podcast, that somebody does have to be the first and only to get the ball rolling, and making that person feel included could be challenging. But I think also, even when you're talking about changing the topics or the images and the metrics, I kind of feel like those have to be first, but then sometimes there's a disconnect in the audience. And so we're showing, maybe just as an example, diverse images in our PowerPoint presentation to all white people in the room. Right. There starts to feel like a disingenuousness or an audience disconnect as these things shift and grow. Do you have any advice there, or like specific techniques or tactics on how to do that without making it feel uncomfortable? Is it always going to
I think
feel uncomfortable? And that's part of the growth.
I sort of cringe when I see that, like an organization, I look at the leadership and it's like all white male. And then like you see all the imagery, it's like a person of color, a woman. It's like, let's, that's the aspiration, but we want to acknowledge, because it can seem very disingenuous. It can be, offensive to the very few who fall within the, underrepresented group to, they're looking at this like, are you kidding me? Like, this is not our organization. So I think that it is, something you said, there's got to be one of the first. Not necessarily, actually, if you think about it, nice. It doesn't have to be one, right? When we bring in that one person, it's like we can set them up for failure and us up for failure, right? Because it's very easy for that person to be seen as a token, right? And so what needs to happen, right, when we're approaching, increasing representation within organization, that recipe has to start happening. Our managers, our leadership, our teams have to start understanding how they can mitigate their biases, potential biases, right? That has to happen so that when we increase representation from underrepresented groups, what happens is the biases that we might have, which are influenced by perhaps some stereotypes that we've carried. And what are stereotypes? They are the generalizations that we make based on a single narrative without context. Doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means I had this one experience. And so I made this assumption about this group. So when I see this person who is now part of this initiative to increase representation, and they're just one, they come in, my unconscious bias plays out, right? So now I'm looking for them to actually feed into that stereotype that I have of them, or to counter that stereotype. That's a lot of pressure to put on one individual. So if they are able to defy that particular stereotype, great. That's a lot of pressure for them to keep going. And the minute they mess up and they feed into their stereotype, right? That's unfortunate for them, right? And we categorize them. So it just ends up being really difficult for that person. And then that might affect, studies show that it will affect their performance. So then it affects their performance. And then therefore we go, you see, this is what diversity could potentially be. Like, this person was not qualified. They can't do the job. So you see that it becomes a vicious cycle. So to not set ourselves up for failure and that person, we really want to think about a more widespread approach. If we really want to increase representation, we're not just looking to increase one or two, right? We're looking to really change representation across the board. And there, at that point, we can start to create images that really represent what the environment that we're in. And that's much more authentic. And it's okay to acknowledge where you are. And it's okay. This is the other thing I try to reassure organizations, like, you don't have to go from point A to point Z overnight. Like, Would you do that in any other like in sales? Would you say you're going to increase your sales in a quarter by 40%? No. So it's not that. Your staff, your employees aren't looking for that. They're just looking to see that you're making an effort. And as you're sharing, if you're being transparent and walking them through the things that you're doing, that gives them reassurance. It's when they think you're not doing anything, that you've lost interest, is when they start to get anxious and they feel like you're being performative.
I love that. I think that's very well said, and it helped me reframe the way I was thinking about that. But I had one more, maybe difficult question. You nailed that one. So we'll see how you do with the next one, which is remote work. I feel like has its benefits and its weaknesses here, especially when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. That obviously we can hire more people from more different places and backgrounds now. And so it does open up that pool of candidates that you talked about. But also in my opinion, everybody's life experiences can be so different that home and working from home is not the same to all of these groups. I'm wondering what you think those current trends are and maybe how we can leverage the best of remote work and minimize some of these weaknesses.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a couple things come to mind around remote work. There was I think it was Boston Consulting Group conducted a study. I don't remember when, I think it was like 4 years ago, looking at groups, women, people of color, and what initiatives organizations can take to really drive, to allow them to feel more included and really consider their unique, positions in the organization. And by far, the number one mentorship came up, right, for both groups, people of color and women. And then the other was flexibility with their work schedule for women, right? And so when we think about remote work, not just women, but individuals, people who are parents, who have, who are caretakers for family members. So in that case, remote work has really allowed for more representation for individuals who might have, a different ability, right? Not a disability, but a different ability that would have created more challenges if they had to physically show up in a workplace. So in that regard, it's wonderful. However, right, there are things that we would have to consider in the space of remote work and the criteria that we put in place, like everyone's got to be on video camera, right? Are we accounting for when, there are individuals in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion who are much more introverted, like myself, who feel really stressed out being on camera sometimes, because it's not like you're in a room where somebody's talking to you and they're looking at all the environment around you. They're literally just staring at your face. And that can really be unsettling for some people. So thinking about how can we create flexibility within this space, like giving people the option of being on video some days, remote, no video Fridays, right? Things like that. That's a different approach. Another thing that comes to mind is, what was I going to say around the remote work? Well, that's just one example. I lost my train of thought with the second example, but
I was going to jump in with that because I think it's even just personalities. And so sometimes, again, if you're looking at specific metric of age or something, you might make a stereotype that it's harder for technology people the older you are, right, or it's easier for younger people to get connected. But I think even just personalities, that I'm an outgoing person. And so working from home became a challenge for me because I'm not actually getting physical interaction with human beings. Yeah. And so I had to learn that I need to get out of the house, and whether it's just go to the grocery store or work from a co-working space or do something with friends and family after work, for my mental health, I needed to work differently than other people. And I think once you realize that, it opens up more options.
Yeah. Thank you. You just reminded me of what I was going to say, because when we think about the remote work, we automatically just equate it to, well, that is inclusive, right? Everybody gets to work from home. So therefore that's the extent to which we need to accommodate. But there's actually more to that, right? We really need to consider individuals who, who are hearing impaired, and making sure that we've created space where, you have closed caption in virtual rooms, individuals who are a little bit more introverted and may not want to be on video camera all the time. How we could consider that, accommodating, or at least considering individuals in that space. Have we considered the different ways in which people communicate in meetings and running meetings? Can we have more structured meetings? Thinking about the time of meetings, right? So when we think about equity, this goes back to remote work. With remote work, we can, companies are able to hire individuals from across the globe. Now, when we think about equity, right? Equity can mean one of two things. It could mean multiculturalism. So we're inviting everyone and to bring their best selves, their unique selves, or it could mean assimilating, right? So we're inviting all these people from all over the globe, different parts of the US, to work for our company and be part of this organization. But are we expecting them to be like one, image idea, or are we inviting them to be themselves? And if we really want that, well, what are we offering in the space of remote work that would allow that? Consider the time that we're setting up these meetings, right? Because, 3 o'clock my time may not work for someone in France, right? So really thinking about that, thinking about the way people communicate, the way we can run these meetings, the way people learn, right? Not everyone can think on the spot in a meeting. So really what we get to do is start to reevaluate how we communicate. And it really can start with whoever's leading these conversations, usually the manager, to really take the time. I say, have a brainstorming session. Ask the people on your team, what can we do differently to make these conversations, these Zoom meetings more engaging? Maybe I'm not the one who needs to run every session. Maybe we take turns, right? Maybe we have a session, which I tried a while ago, where we turn on some music, and we're kind of like, we're working, but we have our cameras off, and we're all available to kind of, if you have a question, you want to ask someone, you just unmute yourself and, hey, so-and-so, Mike, I have a question. And it becomes like a coffee hour type of,
I've done some virtual writing like
Exactly.
that, and I actually really enjoyed it. We all,
Right.
took 5 minutes and then 15 minutes and then a longer session to just
Yeah.
write together on a Zoom call and get stuff done and check in periodically. And it was fun. It felt more like
It's
working
fun,
together
right?
in a room or a classroom than
Yeah.
by yourself.
So it goes back to, the ABCs of diversity. We make it overcomplicated. We overthink it. We feel like we have to have all the solutions. Oh my gosh, I have to know how to fix this virtual situation. Why don't we invite the people who are in these that we're inviting into these virtual conversations to help us figure out a solution? Let it be collaborative. Let's hear from other people to find out how we can make it better. And you don't have to carry the pressure of, oh my gosh, I didn't know. I don't know how to do all this stuff. I don't know how to set a closed caption. I didn't think about that. Like, let's not beat ourselves up, right? There's an opportunity to learn. And so if you preface it with, hey team, as a manager, I'm looking to figure out ways to make these Zoom sessions more effective, more inclusive. What can we do? What can I do to improve your experience? Because I know we're now working, we're all virtual. What can we consider that I haven't considered? Just approach it that way. You'd be surprised by the unique and creative solutions that you'll come up with, you and your team will come up with, that will be unique to what you and your team needs. That's really it.
I love that. And sometimes just ask them the question, even if nobody has any ideas and they're like, no, this is all working great. This time's perfect for me. And then go, all right, at least I checked in and I asked the question.
Right.
And we mentioned the book title again there. So I want to give everybody a chance. Look up the ABCs of Diversity by Martine Kalaw. And the link is in the show notes or in the comments, wherever you are watching or listening to this. Martine, I wanted to get to know you a little bit better here before we wrap up. So a couple of quick ones about you. At this point in your career, you've had a lot of successes, but how do you define success itself? What's the ideal for you?
Oh, the way I defined success is how I feel on Sunday night going into Monday morning, right? Some people dread Mondays. It's like, I've got all these meetings, or they dread it because they're not happy in their workplace or what they do. So how I define it is how I feel on a Sunday night going into Monday morning. Am I excited? Do I
Great
feel like I'm
answer.
fulfilled? Right. That's how I define success.
What about the biggest lesson learned or failure in your career that was a hurdle you had to get over in order to be successful?
That's a really good one. I think the biggest lesson learned is that I am my worst critic, right? I mean, even in showing up in podcasts and, interviews, talks, writing books, it's, we have a certain perception or definition of what success means. And, it's good to dream big and to have lofty goals, but to also give yourself some grace because you've achieved it, you've done it, right? And it's easy to look at Instagram and all these, images, and you're like, oh my gosh, everyone's so much further ahead than I am. But there are a lot of images, right? They're not always true. So being able to just give yourself grace, acknowledge where you are, and while you're working towards this goal of where you want to go and where you aspire to be, give yourself the credit for where you are. That's one of the lessons that I learned, because I feel like I've achieved so much, but there was a time where I didn't even look back to, acknowledge the success. It was just, okay, I got to get here. I have to get there, but let's acknowledge where we are so we can appreciate it and be grateful for it, and then continue to strive for more.
I love that one for me too. I relate to that, and I kind of feel like an imposter syndrome sometimes too.
Yes.
You're like, I don't give myself permission to speak up or celebrate those successes because I didn't match somebody else's or something else that would have been there.
Absolutely.
What about a favorite quote, motto, or mantra?
This is my favorite quote. It sits on my desk all the time. There are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is as though everything is a miracle, by Albert Einstein. I love this quote. This is how I've navigated my entire life.
I love that. Yeah, that's a great one. And that's a new one. We haven't had anybody share that one on the podcast. So we're at like 580 some episodes now. That is a great one. I appreciate you sharing. Now, let's wrap it up for everybody. I'm going to ask you the questions again, but this time we're looking for like 1 sentence, 2 sentence answers, just to sum up what we talked about, leaving the podcast on how to succeed with the ABCs of diversity. What's one attitude you would like people to have?
Be open and be welcoming in the space of DEI.
And one behavior or action item you would like people to do?
Behavior or action item. Identify how diversity can impact a key performance indicator. Find that, look for that.
I like that. And then the best technique, tool, tip, or hack?
To keep it simple, I would say, ask permission to ask questions. I'll leave it there. Ask permission.
That's a Sandler lesson. We don't need to say anymore. Yeah. Salespeople need to do that. Managers need to do that. Diversity, equity, inclusion practitioners need to do that. It's a great lesson. I appreciate you being on the show. Martine Kalaw. You can find her at martinekalaw.com. The ABCs of Diversity is the book. For more information on Sandler, you can go to sandler.com. You can subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening to it right now. And remember, remember, whatever you are, be a good one. The How to Succeed podcast is brought to you by Sandler, the worldwide leader in sales, management, and customer service training with over 200 locations. For more information, go to sandler.com. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to click subscribe to get notified about future sales and leadership videos from Sandler.
The Sandler Summit returns in 2023. Each new event builds exponentially upon the energy and success of the prior year. The 2022 Sandler Summit event was a huge success for everyone who attended, so don't miss the next one. Buy your tickets to the Sandler Summit at sandler.com/summit.